This video is made possible by my supporters on Patreon. Learn more about the special benefits currently available to my patrons by following the link in the description below. In April 2022, just a few months following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a Russian foreign minister boarded a plane bound on a critical mission to New Delhi, India. In his hands, he held the future of the entire Russian state, which, at least in the short term, depended almost entirely on his successful negotiations with the Indian government if it wanted to continue existing in its current form. His mission was simple. The West had sanctioned Russian oil in retaliation against Russia for starting the war in Ukraine, and he needed to find a way to sell this newly sanctioned oil to India before Russia's severe lack of excess storage capacity caused their entire energy industry to completely shut down. If his mission failed, and he left India empty-handed, Russia would be forced to stop the production of oil, which it could no longer store, and millions of Russians would be left without jobs for the foreseeable future. This was a nightmare scenario, one that the foreign minister absolutely needed to avoid if he valued his own life. If millions more blue-collar Russian workers suddenly found themselves out of a job, that would reverberate across the entire Russian economy at a scale that would be impossible for Kremlin propaganda to cover up. People's confidence in the government would begin to fade, and the anti-war protests that were already frequently popping up and being shut down all across Russia could reach a tipping point beyond where the police could continue to suppress them. If the oil deal with India failed, things could quickly spiral out of control into a full-blown domestic crisis. It was a situation not dissimilar to the early days of what eventually led to the Bolshevik Revolution, which had seen the collapse of the Russian czars just over a century earlier. Like during the revolution, many Russians were frustrated that they were being forced to fight in a foreign war abroad, and many were fleeing the country as a result. As in the days of the Bolsheviks, rampant corruption within the Russian government was being exposed, and whistleblowers and political opponents were being silently executed through supposed accidents, or imprisoned with sentences that were basically indefinite. Russia put on a strong external face, but on the inside, people were angry, and cracks were everywhere. And the only thing keeping things from escalating too far was the fact that, for the time being, most people still had their jobs. That meant that people still had something to lose if they stood up against their corrupt government. Take those jobs away, and it might just be the straw that broke the Kremlin's back. As the Russian minister approached India, with Russian diplomats falling out of windows left and right, he did not want to be responsible for the collapse of Putin's government. He needed to return home with a deal in hand. And India fully understood the gravity of the situation. It wouldn't be long until Russia got put in their place. By the time the Russian foreign minister boarded his plane back from New Delhi to Moscow, he had effectively signed over Russia's future status on the world stage to India. Although, at the time, many people didn't realize it. Before these talks, and the sanctions that forced them, Russia had been selling crude oil at an average of $78 per barrel. But by the time the talks were over, that average price would be reduced from $78 to just $51, a 34% drop in top-line revenue. With a production cost of around $44 per barrel, a sales price of $51 didn't leave much meat left on the bone for Russia. In a single conversation, their profit margin had dropped by nearly 80%, from $34 to just $7 per barrel, barely enough to be worth the effort after accounting for other miscellaneous costs. And with the collapse of that profit margin, also came the collapse of one of the only remaining sources of revenue for the entire Russian government. India, which was supposed to be one of Russia's closest allies, had taken advantage of them while they were down. India would become rich on cheap Russian oil, in exchange for helping Russia to merely prevent itself from falling apart at the seams. But while Russia may have managed to save themselves from impending doom, you can only kick the can down the road for so long before you run out of asphalt. And already, less than 2 years after the fateful signing of this deal, India has replaced Russia on the world stage in several major ways, with all indications showing that there is even more to come. Because, no surprise, this story goes a whole lot deeper than cheap Russian oil. And in a minute, I'll demonstrate why this oil deal went exactly as the West intended. As we dive in, if you're enjoying this content so far, let me take a brief moment to ask you to consider checking out my page on Patreon to browse the current list of special benefits I'm offering to supporters of the channel. These episodes can be time-consuming and expensive to produce, and supporters like my patrons make it all possible. So I'm super grateful for each and every one of you, and so are the rest of my viewers. You can learn more in the description of this video. Now, back to our story. To understand just how bad this oil deal really was for Russia, our journey begins on the dark side of the moon. Literally, as we seek to make sense of this deal in light of India's larger geopolitical goals. Something that turns this deal, which, on the surface, may seem like two allies working together to fight back against the West, into a story that rivals Game of Thrones in terms of betrayal and backstabbing. Just around a month before this video was posted, and a little over a year and a half after the oil sanctions began, India and Russia found themselves engaged in a fierce battle straight out of a Cold War history textbook. The goal? To see who could be the first nation to land on the dark side of the moon. Chances are, you may have heard something about this. In August of this year, India made history by becoming the first nation to ever land on the moon's south pole, a truly impressive feat that was achieved with a very low-cost spacecraft. But what a lot of people completely missed about this was the fact that Russia had a spacecraft of its own attempting to accomplish the same mission at the same time, except that Russia's spacecraft didn't stick the landing, and therefore didn't stick the headlines either. And if you didn't hear about the Russian moonlander, that's probably because that's exactly what India intended, and exactly why India was racing them in the first place. To understand what I'm talking about, and how this relates to India and Russia's oil deal, you just need to understand the origins of space travel, which has always been 1 part science and 2 or 3 parts politics. There's a reason that space travel didn't really begin in earnest until the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in the space race as one of the front lines in the Cold War, fighting over who would be the first to space, the first to launch a satellite, and the first to land an astronaut on the moon, as a way to showcase their technological and therefore military and nuclear capabilities without having to actually attack each other. And while that Cold War space race is now over, what many people don't realize is that a new geopolitical space race has recently begun. Only this time, it's between India and Russia, who are fighting tooth and nail over who will have the most influence over a new breed of emerging market economies. It's a battle that India is categorically winning, and which is producing poetic imagery that rivals even the best poets the world has ever seen. As India's moonlander approached its landing target, it flew past a new crater on the moon's surface. This crater was less than a week old, but will scar the surface of the moon permanently. It was created by the crash landing of Russia's own attempt to reach the moon's south pole. And India literally flew past the destroyed shell of Russia and took all of the glory with a seamless landing. It gets even better. The timing of this incident was by no means a coincidence. It was planned to coincide with the day when the Indian Prime Minister would be attending a BRICS summit in South Africa on emerging markets. At this summit, BRICS extended an invitation to several new nations to join the growing economic conglomerate, including Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. One of the biggest power moves BRICS has ever made. And in this environment, while the Indian Prime Minister was basking in the glory of an unprecedented moon landing achievement, and using the opportunity to increase India's status among these new soon-to-be member nations, one person was glaringly absent: Vladimir Putin. He was unable to attend due to the arrest warrant put on his head by the ICC, which would have required South Africa, an ICC signatory, to arrest him on sight if he had attended. So while Putin hid from the gallows, terrified of being brought to justice by his own allies, Modi basked in the glamour shots. The message was clear. Russia couldn't even land in Kyiv, but India was landing on the moon. Russia had attempted its first moon landing since 1976 in a desperate attempt to position itself as the prominent power to the new emerging world markets. It had spent money it didn't have at a time when it needed all hands on deck for the war in Ukraine. And it had lost the gamble. And if that isn't poetic for everything we've seen from Russia for the past 2 years, I don't know what is. Because trust me, the moon is not the only place where India is flying past the destroyed carcass of Russia to claim its own power and glory. They're doing it left and right. And one perfect example of that is India's purchases of cheap Russian oil. What? You thought I forgot about that? Come on. I definitely wasn't going to end this video without giving myself an opportunity to sell this awesome shirt. So, now that we understand the high-stakes competition that India and Russia are currently involved in, trying to claim their share of power over the emerging markets, let's take another look at that fateful oil deal in light of this geopolitical context. Since the Indian oil deal first occurred, Russian state media, and many Russian trolls in the comment section of my videos, have pointed to this cheap oil trade as a sign of Russia's enduring strength in their fight against the West, showcasing the relationship with India as a sign that Russia still had friends willing to support them in their mission. Russia had to portray this as a win, to keep up the spirits of the Russian people when the entire world was turning against them. And the Kremlin has spent decades learning how to masterfully present that exact kind of spin to the Russian population. But Kremlin propaganda aside, the truth is, there's almost no possible way that the Russian government actually believes this. Simply put, if the Indian oil deal was really a geopolitical win, Russia would not have needed to concede to give India such low prices. If India's real goal was to support Russia, they should have been more than happy to purchase from Russia at a price equal to what they were paying other oil suppliers on the open market, defying Western sanctions and price caps. But that's not what happened. Instead, India came to the negotiation table prepared and beat Russia up on price as much as they possibly could, all the way down to the last rupee, demanding a more than 30% discount to the point where Russia could barely afford to keep the lights on and keep their oil industry employed. Russia effectively agreed to work for India for free. This deal is so bad that if it had happened in the Middle Ages, we would have called Russia a vassal state. For a period of time, that's effectively what they were. When you work for free, or basically for free, to provide another nation with your natural resources, in exchange for avoiding complete destruction, you truly are nothing but a vassal. This was a very bad look for Russia at a time when it was battling India for influence over other emerging markets. Rather than being the master that other emerging nations bowed to, Russia itself was forced to bow down to its own master. India was not only extracting Russia's wealth, it was also extracting Russia's geopolitical power. And this type of scenario is exactly what the West intended when they introduced the sanctions and imposed a price cap on Russian oil. To understand why, you just need to ask why the West's strategy involved a price cap and not trying to enforce an outright global trade ban. The reality is that in the current form of the world economy, everyone is still dependent on oil to survive. Since Russia is one of the world's foremost oil suppliers, placing an outright ban on Russian oil would be in nobody's best interests, and potentially disastrous for the global economy, as that would just cause oil prices from remaining suppliers to skyrocket. At the same time, oil is one of Russia's main sources of revenue, and therefore one of the main ways for them to continue funding their war in Ukraine. So it's also in the West's best interests to cut off these revenues as much as possible. The question is, how do you stop the flow of Russian oil revenues without stopping the flow of Russian oil? The answer? You set and enforce a global price cap that makes it just barely worth it for Russia to continue production. When India purchased Russian oil at this low price, they were playing right into the West's hands. The world would get to keep Russian oil, but the majority of the profits would now go to India instead of the Kremlin. India was able to buy so much cheap oil from Russia that even though they have a weak domestic oil production industry and historically have to import over 80% of their crude oil supply, they soon found themselves not only meeting their own needs, but also with a massive surplus, a surplus that they then turned around and sold to Europe. A lot of the gas Europeans were filling their cars with during the war in Ukraine was still coming from Russia. But the beauty was that Russia was basically giving it to them for free. India, not Russia, was the one holding the profits. Some people have been critical of this trade and have called this blood oil, urging the EU to close this open back door. But the EU has consistently responded that buying Russian oil from India is actually meeting their goals of weakening Russian power and revenues at the same time, by giving India an opportunity to enrich themselves on Russia's back, and to replace Russia in the global economy. It's a situation of choosing the lesser of two evils. The West prefers a strong India to a strong Russia, mainly because Russia is close with China, while India and China have significant friction. I won't go into detail about India and China's relationship here, but you can learn more in my video about the collapse of Russian arms exports. The point is, the West has every advantage when India becomes comparatively stronger than Russia, whether it be through a lopsided oil trade, a better space program, or stronger manufacturing empowered by cheap oil. Even better, if it's all three at the same time. While Russia invaded Ukraine to grow its geopolitical influence, the truth is, this war is eroding what influence Russia had left in the world. Fast forward to today, this deal was so bad for Russia, they had to turn back on it, and have slowly decreased the discount they are willing to offer to India. It didn't take them long to realize that it was one-sided, and that India itself was becoming a bigger threat to their geopolitical goals than even the West was. India, in turn, has slowed their purchases of Russian oil in response to higher prices, because the trade was never about supporting Russia, but rather about milking Russia's desperate situation for all it was worth. Further Russian desperation may cause this cheap oil trade to return, but even if the cheap oil flows are largely over, it doesn't matter. The point is, Russia had to concede to India to survive as a nation, and if the Russian people can't understand why that's a problem for them, there might be no hope for them after all. With friends like BRICS, who needs enemies? I just wish someone would look at me the way that India looks at cheap Russian oil. If you appreciate this content, consider checking out my page on Patreon for more ways you can support the channel. As a thank you, I'm offering a growing list of special benefits to the channel's supporters. Once again, I'm super grateful for each and every one of you, and so are the rest of this channel's viewers. To continue the story of how India is shifting away from Russia in geopolitics, be sure to check out my video on how Ukraine has destroyed the Russian arms industry, and learn why India is now buying their arms, not from Russia, but from somebody surprising. See you on the next one.